Black Hills Information Security, the leaders in penetration testing and active defense. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to request a quote today. Threat Connect is the industry's most widely adopted threat intelligence platform, built to unite the people, processes, and technologies across your security team, your organization, and your entire ecosystem of partners. Threat Connect's threat intelligence platform enables your team to collaborate, analyze, and make sense of threat data all in one place. Empower your team towards fast and efficient analysis that leads to decisive action. Transform your entire threat detection and response program today. Claim your free account at threatconnect.com/securityweekly. Endgame automates the hunt for both known and never-before-seen adversaries and enterprise networks. Built on unique knowledge of the adversary's tools, techniques, and tactics, Endgame's centrally managed agent prevents, detects, and responds to advanced adversaries at the earliest stages of the kill chain without prior knowledge. Endgame, automate the hunt. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. In this segment, we're going to talk with Jen and Harley, who've already been talking on the program. But Jen and Harley, I wanted to, we should formally introduce both of you to our audience. So Jen, since you're here sitting next to me, Angela Lady, why don't you go first?
Okay, thanks. I am the Vice President of Community and Public Affairs at Rapid7. And that basically means that I spend my time working with security researchers both at the company and across the company and trying to think about how we promote better research, create protections for researchers in policy, that kind of thing. And I'm really just sort of thinking about how do we as a community tackle security sort of en masse, because I don't think anyone's going to do it on their own and actually solve the problem, much though we'd like that to happen.
And Harley?
So I'm Harley Geiger, and I'm Director of Public Policy at Rapid7, and I lead Rapid7's public policy advocacy and government affairs activities. A lot of what I do is focused on protecting security researchers and promoting policies that strengthen the cybersecurity ecosystem in general.
So one thing, and it's interesting, we were already talking about it on the show, is the IoT space. But in the interest of protecting researchers, there was recent modifications to the legislation or some amendment that basically says it's okay to do research on your own device. Are you familiar with some of the things that happened recently in that area?
Yeah.
Yes.
So Harley and I both have worked on this. This is the DMCA.
Yes.
So the DMCA is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and it was passed in '98, and basically says that you can't circumvent or make use technology that circumvents technology protections to protect copyright. And when they enacted the law, they recognized that technology moves really fast. So they created this process whereby every 3 years you could, anybody in the community could request an exemption to the law. And they have this process where they gather together requests, and then they go through 2, I think, comment periods. And then the Library of Congress and the Copyright Office seek counsel from various people they think are experts, and they make a ruling on what exemptions will pass. And the exemptions last 3 years, and then everything goes back to zero, and the process starts again. So a year ago, when they went through this process, they approved an exemption for security research on consumer-oriented devices with restrictions, so like not in production environments, for example. And they said, we're going to pass this, and we're going to say it won't come into effect, apart from for voting machines, it won't come into effect for a year. And that year passed at the end of October, so it is now in effect.
And was the EFF involved in this process, or am I thinking of something different?
The EFF was involved, yeah.
The EFF was involved. A lot of people were involved. Yeah. There's actually a pretty good outpouring of support for this temporary exemption for security researchers from EFF, the Center for Democracy and Technology. Rapid7 was involved. There was a lot of folks that asked for this. And the temporary exemption does come with some caveats, like it's not just a free-for-all. For example, the research has to take place in a safe and controlled environment, and it has to just be for security research. It can't be for any other purpose. And it has to be a lawfully acquired device. You can't just pick something up off the street or steal something, for example. And you cannot violate other laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And then they restrict the types of devices you can apply the research to. It's consumer-oriented devices, land vehicles. But it's much better than the status quo. It's way better than before the exemption. And yes, now you are able to hack your own consumer devices as long as you're not breaking other laws and as long as you're doing it in a safe and controlled way.
And Harley mentioned that lots of people were involved. There were actually 4 requests that were filed for security research exemptions. There were 2 sort of broad requests, and then there was one specifically for medical device research and one specifically for automotive or vehicular research.
And I was going to ask that, Jen Harley, if this was a consumer-based exemption, that means that medical devices, SCADA devices fall outside of this exemption, correct?
Implantable medical devices fall within the exemption. SCADA devices fall outside of it. And I think the reason that they have implantable medical devices is because that is a good way to distinguish between individual use medical devices versus like large-scale hospital machinery.
Would an IV or if you have diabetes,
An insulin pump.
Insulin pump, thank you. Would that fall under this exemption? It's not really implanted, right? Or does it fall under?
It does fall under it, and we actually recently did some research on on an insulin pump. Mm-hmm. Not anything to do with the exemption. We didn't do it because of the exemption. It was Jay Radcliffe who did it, and he's diabetic. And
love that guy. Used to work with him. Love that guy.
Yeah, and he's actually really into the RF stuff. So so he sort of quite famously did research 5 or 6 years ago now on an insulin pump that was connected to him physically.
Yep.
And got kind of scared about what he found, which was that with minimal complexity, he could either push a fatal dose or withhold insulin delivery altogether, which could also be fatal. And after that, he made a decision that he was no longer going to use an insulin pump. So fast forward, and his primary caregiver said, no, I think you should look at this again, and you should consider one. And so it was during the process of him considering one that he started the research on the Animus one-touch ping, and he found that he could the Animus One Touch ping has a remote and communicates over RF, and he found that he could basically exploit that communication. And again, it was the same thing. He could suspend insulin delivery, and that's problematic.
As soon as you said remote and wireless connectivity, I was pretty much knowing where that was going to go.
Yeah, so it's not. It doesn't connect to the internet or anything like that. It is just the RF frequency stuff. And so we worked with Johnson & Johnson, who own Animus, and sort of worked through the process. But I mean, as Jay would be the first to point out, were he here, that this is a situation where there are a lot of parameters that kind of, and I was going to say this when we were talking about the RF stuff earlier, is that you often see research in this regard where it like sounds very like, oh my God, and very sci-fi. And then you hear the parameters and you're like, oh, it's not as bad as I thought it was. So in this situation, you'd have to be within a certain distance, and you'd have to have very specialist equipment and very specialist knowledge. And I mean, even when J&J were trying to recreate it, they were like, Jay, can you tell us exactly what you did? Because it's complicated to do. So Jay was, as a diabetic, he was very keen to say, hey, don't panic. Don't start ripping stuff out of your body. Yeah. Like, that is not the response.
The application of this will probably, for now anyways, be fairly limited. And the health risk to removing that is significantly greater than the technological risk currently.
The counterpoint to that, though, is, while there's certain conditions that need to be met, who would be able to do that? Somebody that was trying to do it. Somebody that really wanted to do it. So is it a viable attack vector if you're trying to kill somebody? Maybe. The Joe Citizen, who hopefully doesn't have too many enemies, probably doesn't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I
had a quick question. Could you say again which government agencies put this out?
This is the Library of Congress, which runs the Copyright Copyright Office. So the Librarian of Congress, it's actually technically an agency under Congress. They operate copyright laws, or enforce them anyway. And so this
is anybody else somewhat bothered that I don't believe that they have any type of expertise in this area? Why are they the ones that are putting out this exemption?
So they're putting out the exemption because they were required to by Congress back when the DMCA was passed, and they were required to do it as part of a copyright law because software is a copyrighted work. And in terms of their technical acumen, that's why they rely on the private sector. That's why they have a comment period, and so they take in a large number of comments and testimony from experts like the people sitting here to decide what to do about the law. But they are constrained by what Congress has asked them to do. And in the end, I think they did the right thing. They put forth an exemption that does give security researchers a lot more leeway.
And they also consult with other parts of the government that have more expertise. So in the case of this specific exemption, they sought counsel from NTIA, the National Telecommunication and Information Administration, maybe?
They're actually required to do that by law.
And they talked to the FDA, and they talked to the EPA, and they got input from all of those agencies as well. And I know that the FDA and NTIA were both supportive of there being security research exemption, although obviously with boundaries.
Do you find that the manufacturers of these devices are more willing to work with researchers because the researchers are now working with an exemption of an existing of existing legislation?
Yeah. So we've heard directly from manufacturers in a number of different industries that the exemption has had a huge impact on their business in terms of their ability to get buy-in in the organization for organizational change. And so getting things like vulnerability handling programs in place has been a change. And in the time since the exemption was first announced, we've seen GM roll out a vulnerability disclosure program. Several of the other automotive manufacturers have either followed or are looking at following. We've seen the same on the medical side. So, it was funny, when we disclosed to J&J, we disclosed to them a week before they unveiled their new vulnerability disclosure process. So we were their test case, which was kind of
That's awesome.
Fascinating. And it is great. Like, you think about an organization of that size, which is a Fortune 50, and absolutely massive, and they deal with things like talcum powder. And the breadth of what they're dealing with, and then they've got us turning up and being like, so we found this thing in this product.
And your talcum powder.
Right, and like they, one of the things that was kind of a fantastic like aha moment for us as we were walking through the process with them was realizing that often when they are in a situation where someone knocks on their door and says, we don't like your product because of X, they actually come with a bevy of lawyers and a plaintiff suit. And they're like, we're taking you to court. And so for us to turn up and be like, we want to work with you and help you through it, they were like, what? What?
We don't understand.
That mean? Yes. What? Should we get the law? I don't understand how to process this.
You mean they're used to being attacked 100% of the time?
You know how that feels?
Yeah, that's funny.
Are there lessons that we can learn from working with medical device companies in the automotive industry that we can apply to some of these other consumer devices that, like we established earlier, are not necessarily life-threatening in the immediate sense, but there are some concerns for public safety and public health?
So I think the biggest lesson that we can learn, honestly, the biggest lesson that I try and make sure people hear as we've been going through, Harley mentioned earlier on that the NTIA is running an IoT process. They've also been running a multi-stakeholder process on vulnerability disclosure and handling. And there's been people from all sorts of industries participating in that. And there's been a fairly natural amount of cynicism from the security research community about it. And a part of that cynicism is vulnerability disclosure is not a new topic. We've been talking about this for 30 years. We have ISO standards. People still aren't, responding well. And I think the biggest lesson that we can learn is that context changes. And context changing has a really big impact. Things change. Like we have the same challenge, right? We do a lot of vulnerability research. We do a lot of vulnerability disclosures as a result. And when I started in the NTIA process a little over a year ago, maybe almost a year and a half, we would say that we reckoned that in the disclosures we did, probably about 80% of the time, it was crickets. People either didn't acknowledge it or, that was most commonly what happened, or sometimes we get legal threats. And I would say in the time that the process has been running, that's changed pretty significantly. And we did a disclosure earlier in the year. The security research team hates it when I tell this story.
Perfect. Let's hear it.
So it was about Xfinity home security. So we did our usual process, which is we reach out to the vendor and we try and disclose, and then 15 days later we go to CERT and disclose to them, and then they reach back out to the vendor and give them 45 days. And if we don't hear anything, if it's crickets, then that's the timeline that sticks. If we hear things and they're engaged and they're working on it, we'll agree a timeline that works for everybody. So we reached out to Security Xfinity and a bunch of other, Xfinity email addresses and notified them and heard nothing and thought, well, fine, and told CERT and went ahead with our process and went public 60 days later in total. And when we went public, Comcast turned around and said, hi, we're Comcast. We're the company. Xfinity's a brand. Security at Comcast works just fine, and we'd be happy to reply to any emails on that email address. And we were like, oh, right. Oops. And the challenge with us is, we'd fallen into that trap of we were so used to the fact that people didn't respond that we assumed that's what was happening in the situation. And in actual fact, once we were talking to the right people at Comcast, they were super responsive, and they jumped on the problem. They were like, we want to find a solution to this. Let's work on it. And so I think that's the challenge. That's one of the learnings that I would say that you can apply pretty evenly across the board is it's really easy for people who've been doing this for a long time to get really cynical about the process. And it's really important to remember that context changes and people's behavior changes in different context.
In email addresses?
I was going to say, I might also argue that it's also really easy to forward Xfinity report.
I was going to ask that too.
I suspect that Xfinity might have done that now. I don't know, but they might have done that now.
Since Jen said people that have done this a really long time, I feel like I need to speak up. Could you expound a little bit more on the changing context? I'm not tracking with you.
The DMCA exemption is a really good example of the changing context.
Exactly.
Right. This is the first time that we have in a law that is well over almost 2 decades old. We have a specific limitation of liability for security researchers in federal law, and that's just one. We're hearing a lot of talk now in Congress about the value of security researchers in different contexts. There have been different laws that have been proposed that would have expanded liability for researchers of all types. And the FTC went to bat for security researchers in a car hacking bill. I've personally seen on the state level there have been some state laws that have passed that would have been harmful to security researchers, but now people are recognizing the benefit of independent cybersecurity research and are taking action to protect them. I think that DMCA exemption is the best example of that, but there are others too. The appreciation of independent cybersecurity research and the awareness of its value is growing in government as well as outside the government. Companies are adopting vulnerability disclosure and handling policies. So I think the context is changing. It'll continue to. If I may add an additional lesson to this about the context changing, which is that it's hopeful, I think, right now. The context changing is changing in a positive direction, but actions that are unsafe or irresponsible could change the context in a different direction.
Yep.
Like it can provoke a backlash, which means that the security research community, and it has to be the security research community. It can't be the government. It can't be lawyers. Needs to be aware that irresponsible actions will potentially result in a backlash and restrictions on the security research community. I mean, it's going to be to some extent up to the community to police itself.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I would also say one of the other things that's changing context is headlines, right? Like last year, I think it was last year, I don't know, time sort of warps. When was the year of the branded vulnerability?
Still going.
Still going.
But it's calmed down a little bit. Like
late last year.
Started with Heartbleed.
Right.
It was 14 and 15.
Exactly.
Heartbleed was 2014.
I'm just disappointed we haven't gotten the branded one with a theme song yet.
So, oh my God.
And a dance. I want a theme song and a dance.
A logo,
I
a
feel
website,
like
a
we could. This is a
theme song.
collaboration that needs to happen.
Larry.
We can make this
we
work.
could get it behind that.
I feel like there could be a
Yes.
lot of argument on what the song is going to be, but I think we can totally make this happen. But the point is, like, when that happened, when there were lots of high-profile vulnerabilities, I mean, before Heartbleed, how many vulnerabilities made major headlines, like New York Times headlines?
Few.
Right. And so when you have a situation where my mom is going to me, can I use my banking website? Is it safe? And people way outside the echo chamber are getting involved in vulnerabilities and like having an opinion on them. Then you have a situation where that changes the context for companies who are selling products because they start to understand that the public is getting a higher level of consciousness about this, and it isn't yet at the point where it's widespread affecting buying decisions, but it's starting to creep into that direction, and so that changes the context as well.
How do we deal with the international vulnerability disclosure? And also, I mean, we talked about before, like most of the IoT devices are made in China, and then we're importing the U.S. And you just said, well, everything that we make has a small computer in it. Yet Samsung makes my washing machine and dryer, which I'm kind of scared about now, and phones and things like that. So what's it like dealing with even smaller international companies in terms of vulnerability disclosure, more importantly?
I mean, I think the international situation, I think when you are dealing with a global economy and you are making rules for it on a localized, nationalized level, that is extremely challenging. And that relates to whether you're talking about data sovereignty or whether you're talking about IoT security, like whatever it is, encryption standards, like that is a hard, complicated problem to deal with. And it's not going to be something that gets dealt with very quickly or very easily, unfortunately. And unfortunately, it looks like the best way that we have to deal with it in terms of like putting a pragmatic barrier in place is export controls, which introduces its own set of nightmares.
Yeah, how does that work on the internet?
I mean, really, it doesn't, right? So it's a huge challenge.
It works on the internet for people who are trying to follow the law, right? So companies.
So again, it's gun control.
But gun control does work for people who are trying to follow the law, right? It's
as
not
long
going
as you're willing to follow the law, it works.
Well, so take for example companies who have penetration testing products. There are export controls on some of those products, right? Like there's
Does anyone
already
know a company that has
I might have think of. I'm drawing a blank. Sorry.
Meta something.
Sorry.
No,
So-
you know what? I if I could make a comment, I think it leans towards, and I've been asserting this for years, that it leans towards the increasing balkanization of the internet, because
yes,
I think that the world, in some sense, cannot deal with this. They cannot comprehend the concept of a global flat space, and I think you're going to see increasing. I mean, we're already seeing it. Look at the increase in VPN vendors that allow you to enter another country's space for the use of their services. I think we're going to see more and more of that due to the inability to deal with this on a global scale.
There may be maybe one person at this table who may want to watch the Beeb from time to time and can't while she's here.
Exactly. People keep telling me, get a VP. Oh, no, it's just a mess.
So the balkanization of the internet is going to be accelerated, I think, much less by export controls and much more by data localization requirements. So requirements that companies keep data in a particular physical location. I think that is going to lead to a much more divided and segregated internet than export controls. And
completely agree with you.
Look no further than the recent law that was passed by China, which does require data localization in many circumstances.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Also, I think we're going to see, a lot of things in that area. I think data localization is one of the primary drivers that we're going to see in that area. Export controls, they really lean towards trade barriers in a lot of ways. And whether or not we see that, well, we know the current political climate globally. I think we can anticipate an increasing sense of export controls worldwide. But no, I think you're absolutely right. The data localization and the regional privacy laws, specifically, I think Europe has been leading this effort, is going to absolutely amplify that effect.
When you say Europe, I would just like to be clear that, like, within Europe, there is a huge difference in how this issue is seen, right? Like, Germany is one end of the spectrum, and the UK is
we're
pretty much the other end of the spectrum, right?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I forgot. We're not part of Europe anymore.
I've been. I've been across the pond. I've been to Canada.
Jen, when you Brits were burning the White House in Australia, we just went to the beach and had another beer.
You were meant to be working. We sent you out there to work. What are you talking about?
Yeah, so
Maybe actually sent them out there to die. That's a different story together.
We don't really have
that's fair.
And furthermore, Larry, we didn't die. We actually flourished rather spectacularly.
And you came back to beat us in any sporting activity at all.
Absolutely. Brilliantly, in fact.
Back here in the U.S., because we're the U.S. Senate. No, I'm just kidding. We're not.
This is all we care about. It's the US.
Didn't in the UK they approve the Snoopers charter?
That's right.
This week.
What is that?
I was actually thinking about bringing that up.
Go ahead, Harley.
The UK did pass a very sweeping surveillance law, which could. It's kind of unclear the limits of this law, but it could require companies to break their own encryption at government request. Is one of the provisions. China also has a similar provision in their law, but the UK
and Russia
just passed this.
Yeah, we're thinking of changing our tagline to the surveillance state.
That's a good one.
Right now, from what I read, all service providers have to keep 12 months of records of all browsing history on all of their users. It grants the ability for law enforcement or government to request that information without having a court order. Simply just, I request it, you have to give it to me. Kind of entry. Also, I think it has another one where it gives law enforcement the power to hack any system that they need to hack, to gather information as they need, were the three main points of contention from that charter.
Although the government hacking thing is not new, and it's not certainly the United States does it as well. The rules on government hacking are not entirely set in stone because they're still figuring out exactly what meets Fourth Amendment standards and what should require a warrant and what shouldn't. But it has been going on for some time. A lot of that takes place at the court level, and so that part I'm a little bit less concerned with because I don't find it to be novel. But data retention.
The Fourth Amendment doesn't apply outside of U.S. borders, does it?
That's right. But the UK government, to my knowledge, is not new to hacking systems for law enforcement purposes either. But the data retention and the encryption piece worry me considerably more. And one of the reasons why I'm worried as a U.S. citizen is because if enough countries start to pass laws like this, then it becomes more of a global norm, and it becomes more acceptable in the eyes of lawmakers to do something similar here in the United States. I think that the United States is not in a position right now to pass something like a requirement that encryption have a backdoor. And one of the reasons, like one of the most compelling arguments against a backdoor into encryption has been that our systems are not really set up for it. It would undermine everybody's security. But if a lot of other countries around the world do it, and U.S. companies adapt themselves to that legal environment, so they do already have backdoors in their systems, then it becomes a lot more difficult to argue that it's going to undermine security to pass something like that in the U.S.
I wanted to transition the conversation into. I was actually presenting today, talking about the state of state-sponsored hacking, right? And I think for me, one of the most interesting things was the documentary film 0 Days, which I was like, oh, here we go, like another thing on Stuxnet. I've heard so much about Stuxnet, and then I watched it. I was like, wow, that was actually really good.
Suddenly you learned a lot about how centrifuges work.
Yes, it was awesome. But not only that,
it's a lot better.
And in subsequent research, I realized the lack of any global statutes, laws, guidelines, correct me if I'm wrong, Jen and Harley specifically, about basically countries hacking into other countries in the so-called cyber arms race, as it's termed in the press. But where do we stand today in terms of any type of regulation or treaties? And I'm curious if you have any insights in the treaty that Obama negotiated with China about cyber arms, and where we stand today. If treaty is not the right word there.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Harley.
I think a lot of the rules are not really written right now, but generally speaking, an incursion onto another country's computer networks is considered more or less on the same level as an incursion onto their physical property. Like it is an incursion on their territorial sovereignty, their national sovereignty.
It's an act of war, in other words.
Not necessarily. I don't think it necessarily escalates immediately to an act of war. I think that there's other levels before you get to all-out war, thankfully. But it is considered an incursion onto sovereignty. But
it's looked more as espionage.
One of the ways that
depending on exactly what's being done, I guess. Like a DDoS attack is not necessarily espionage, but a DDoS attack is considered like a physical attack. Yeah.
One of the ways I think that the US government tried to deal with this problem is they passed an executive order that says that if you attack, if you launch a cyber attack against a US entity or US assets, and there are very specific boundaries on this, and unfortunately I haven't looked at it for about 2 years, I don't remember it very clearly, but they can basically issue sanctions. And they've used it, I think, a couple of times. And so the idea is like they can say to an organization, even like it's that granular. They can say to a company, if they think that a company is guilty of persistent cyber espionage against a U.S. entity, they can say, well, you're not allowed to do business with the U.S. anymore. Mm-hmm. We're just going to sanction you completely. But there are boundaries on this, and I can't remember the full details of them, unfortunately.
I think one of the things that's been difficult in getting clear rules in this space is attribution. Like it's not easy for
attribution's easy though, right?
You just blame Russia or China.
Well, a couple things on that. Attribution can happen, but if we're able to attribute an attack with a lot of certainty, it usually means we're able to do so because we've got sensors ourselves. Like we have secret capabilities ourselves that is giving us the evidence to make that attribution. And so we are sometimes reluctant to attribute an attack to a particular nation because it would reveal our own secret capabilities. And if we misattribute, then things could get ugly.
Absolutely.
So attribution has been a real issue. But that also means that the United States' recent attribution of the DNC hacks and the DCCC hacks to Russia is sort of precedent setting. Like that's significant and it's relatively new. We don't do that often. Another instance where we did attribute hacks to individuals, at least. This was in the past couple of years. We actually did attribute some hacks to individuals in China, and I think most of them were army officers. Now, we didn't implicate the Chinese government in that attribution, but we did issue warrants essentially for the arrest of these individuals so they can't come onto U.S. soil, which they probably won't, but the attribution itself is significant. So that's another norm that might be changing.
They could come onto U.S. soil, but it'd be really dumb on their behalf to do so.
Well, I feel like no reference to the Zero Day documentary is complete without acknowledging the just fantastic work that documentary did in revealing just how impactful it can be to watch a balloon burst in slow motion from every angle imaginable over and over again.
Now I know what you're referencing. Yes.
I have the movie. I haven't seen it yet. So
I'm sorry, spoilers. I've given it all away. The balloon bursts. I'm so sorry.
Okay. No,
also, the ship sinks in Titanic. I'm sorry, but... Shit.
Oh, fuck. Yeah, she says it. Oh,
and next thing you're going to tell me the internet is for porn.
I've heard that somewhere. I have no personal experience of it, of course, but I've heard it somewhere.
Larry debug's a lot better. Go for debug.
No, that's zero. Yeah, so there's two different. There's zero day
and 0 days. The movie is days.
Excuse me, zero days.
Yep. Yeah, no, sorry, I've been spending too much time actually watching Idiocracy lately.
Well, you
Haven't
mean,
we all?
I heard that's a documentary, right?
Yes. And it was very timely. I gave my talk on the IoT stuff in Arlington, Virginia at Sans Hackfest a couple of days before the election. And one of the slides is a picture of the cover of the movie. And a quote from one of the directors was, "I never thought Idiocracy would become a documentary."
It's sad.
In some ways it has, for sure.
In many cases, potentially. Yeah. But
so likely there's somewhat an arms race that we're seeing, right? I mean, we can see somewhat where government funding is going, especially in the U.S., and surmise that, yes, we're putting a lot of money into basically arming people to break into other countries.
How could there not be an arms race? Right? I mean, if you know that nations that are hostile to yours are creating these weapons, they'll have a devastating effect. We all recognize it's the future. Then are you yourself being derelict in your duties if you're not doing the same?
And isn't that the business of government? I mean, that's not new news, is it?
No.
I mean, if we knew that many other nations were creating nuclear weapons and we just decided we're not going to create nuclear weapons at all, we would live in a very different world, I think.
You know what? We need to develop Star Wars for the internet.
Cyber Star Wars?
Yes. Because you are familiar with the reason for Star Wars. It was a complete misinformation campaign.
Yes.
Yep.
It was social engineering at its finest.
Yep.
Over expenditure for the Russians that actually broke them.
Yep, exactly.
No,
when in fact we had absolutely nothing.
Your statement is actually prophetic. I predict we will have a similarly named campaign on the cyber warfare context in the future, in the near future. I would say in the next 4 months.
I would not be surprised.
So somewhere around February of 2017, first 100 days?
End of January.
Exactly.
Harley, Jen, were there more was there other stuff that you both are working on currently that you wanted to inform our audience about? I want to open the floor to you. We covered it.
Harley?
So, did a lot of stuff on DMCA lately. We've touched a little bit on some of the guidelines that federal agencies are coming out with on IoT security and certain other areas, and we're commenting on a lot of those. So, for example, the connected car guidelines that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is issuing. Also, I think a lot of folks are trying to get their bearings on how to engage with the new administration on cybersecurity, which is kind of a lot of legwork in itself. And two other areas. One is CFAA and computer crime laws in states. Those two areas also consume a fair amount of time because they have a lot of impact on not only security researchers, but also ordinary users.
And you know, you guys heard of Aaron's Law?
Yes, Aaron Schwartz's. Yeah.
Harley, why don't you kind of...
Yeah, he drafted it.
Yeah, give us a quick rundown of that, please.
Of Aaron's Law?
Yeah, and how your involvement in how it came to be.
So I was working for Representative Zoe Lofgren at the time in the House of Representatives, and it was actually the night before my bachelor party when Aaron Swartz committed suicide, and the press detailed sort of the circumstances surrounding that. And at my bachelor party, the Congresswoman said that she wanted to draft a law that addressed this problem and prevented what she saw as prosecutorial overreach in the future. And so we actually went into a very long process to talking with companies and with researchers and law enforcement and civil society organizations to try to look at ways to scale back the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with what Aaron Swartz had been charged with. Most of the charges were under the CFAA. He was facing a lot of them. And
from what I understand from the case, Harley, was basically he downloaded a bunch of documents off of those like library systems that you need a username and password to gain access to the information. He downloaded a bunch of that. I don't know if he put it on the internet or not, but that was the gist of what I got from that case, and he was charged under CFAA.
That's right. And in the end, I mean, I'll skip through the long process that we went through to try to draft something. In the end, we would have codified a court opinion that is actually right now has a lot of momentum behind it, which would say that mere violation of terms of service is not a violation of the CFAA. So one of the interpretations of the CFAA is that if you simply violate terms of service or violate a written agreement of some kind, like an employer agreement, then you are, in fact, violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and it can lead to felony charges. That's one component, and that's the most significant and controversial component of Aaron's Law. The other two components would have actually had given more help to Aaron Swartz than the first one. Everyone focuses on that first one, but we would have also struck what we considered to be a redundant portion of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which actually made up a third of Aaron Swartz's charges. And we had a lot of reforms on penalties. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, if you look at the penalties in the CFAA, they're very complex, and it's very easy to sort of jump from kind of a lower penalty up to a much higher penalty. And so we made that harder in a way that we thought was still responsible. So Aaron Swartz would not have gotten off completely free under Aaron's Law, but what we saw is the disproportionate penalty that he was facing would have been scaled down a lot. And
interesting.
I've subsequently learned in researching the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that this law, which by the way is still introduced in Congress, it's still circulating, is the only legislation since the enactment of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that would have actually scaled it back in any significant way.
That's awesome. So now the first part that deals with terms of service, would that have worked in like Weave's favor for what he was prosecuted with? I don't know if you're familiar with that case too, but
I am familiar with that case. There's a couple of factors in Weave's case that makes that complicated. So if Weave was only gathering publicly available information on the internet, then yes, it would have protected him. But if you look at the actual details of what he, or more accurately, his co-conspirator did, they did not just gather publicly available information. They did circumvent a technological access barrier by doing certain things, like, for example, spoofing the user agent, like pretending that they were using an iPad when in fact they were not, and using what I think were the faking the unique IDs of the iPads to do it. So it's a difficult argument to make that it was just publicly available information. It would have given them a bit of a boost, but that's the way that those arguments were going anyway. Because this is a split in the courts right now as to which theory applies. Aaron's Law would have made it pretty definitively that terms of service
So
violations.
is Aaron's Law been enacted, or is it just a bill?
No, Aaron's Law has not been enacted. It's just a bill. And it's,
Haven't you seen Schoolhouse Rock?
He's lived it.
It's just a bill. What?
Oh boy.
So I think that it's a really difficult law to try to change. I actually don't really expect Aaron's Law, as it is currently written, to have a lot of momentum, especially in this Congress, the one that we have coming up after January.
But nonetheless, Harley has actually drafted a CFAA reform bill, and you have not, Jeff. So,
There's that.
So, but there
If it's not a law, it's a bill. I was just questioning because Aaron's Law makes it sound like it's a law, but it's not.
So
it's a bill.
That's a good point. But that's just the name. That's just the name of the bill that the Congresswoman wanted to give to it, and her reasoning was so that people will have a ready example of CFAA misuse when they want to know what the justification for a law like that. And although Aaron's Law has challenges, it's going to be difficult to move in Congress. It did, I think, open up a lot of people's eyes to the need for CFA reform, and there's been increasingly people recognize that this is a problem.
Yep.
You cannot really have a law that treats every violation of terms of service as a potential felony when we're going to be surrounded by computers in our everyday lives. Mm-hmm. So I think that people recognize that something needs to be done. There's just a lot of disagreement as to what should be done.
And as we've learned, law is just words on a page.
You had to bring it back there. Bring it full circle.
Aaron's Law is just words on a page.
Well, a question about that. If law is just words on a page, what is code?
Ooh.
Zeros.
We're gonna ponder that in a very short break. We're gonna come back and talk with Alex.
Can I just give a cheesy final thought moment?
Please.
My cheesy final thought moment is that
Final thoughts with Jen.
Right, exactly. In the point of time in which we sit as we do this, there's a lot of uncertainty about the government and what we're going to see in the administration and what policy they're going to pursue. I would just say to people in the security community that from my personal experience, there are a lot of really awesome people who are working in the government who actually are very sympathetic with security researchers and really care about trying to improve cybersecurity generally, even if they do use the word cyber attached to security. And I think a lot of those people will still be around, hopefully. Hopefully they will stay and they will continue the work they're doing. And so I just kind of want to say to people, don't write them off, give them a chance. If you're interested in policy, if you're interested in trying to shape different outcomes, better outcomes, find solutions, then get involved and find those people. There are lots of them, and they are very open to talking to cybersecurity professionals and being educated by cybersecurity professionals and helping them find solutions. And that is my cheesy Jenny Springer moment.
That was a good cheesy thing. We're going to take a short break. Excuse me. Come right back. Stay tuned.
Meanwhile...